I come from an organization called Cognitive Edge. We have global presence, but we're headquartered in Singapore. We're a really lead outfit. The entire team comprising of our software developers, we only have about 15 people. But we have a network of about 2,000 independent consultants that we draw from. So the idea of crowdsourcing is actually really close to our hearts. All our marketing is also done independently and through digital marketing. So every time we have a problem, because we're a lean organization, when we need extra manpower, what we do is we actually draw from our network. So we understand crowdsourcing in a very intimate way. What Cognitive Edge does, like Effie actually introduced, is that we deal with complexity, we deal with sense-making, and we deal with micro-narrative. And we also produce software for consulting purposes, and our software, a lot of it is actually based on the theory that underlies Cognitive Edge practices. And I apologize, unlike the other consultants, the other presenters, I have no videos. I have about 9 slides and a lot of me talking, so I ask that you bear with me. What we basically do is distributed cognition. So we understand that meaning for people, so that comes from the sense-making part, meaning is actually not independently invested. So it's not just how we make sense of things. We make sense of things in our social and physical environments. And that, when we interact with that, we actually constantly make new meaning. And a very real-world example, which is something we probably all understand, is collaborative tagging on the internet. So what people do is they upload certain content, and then people collaborate to tag it, or they actually create new content around it. So Wikipedia is a really good example. But Wikipedia is actually curated by other Wikipedia users. So the important thing for us is that, yes, we have to draw from the wisdom of crowds, but there is a distinction to be made between the wisdom of crowds and the tyranny of the herd. I don't know if you're familiar with this picture here, but this is actually taken from the Simpsons movie. And The Simpsons is a really interesting cartoon. It's been around for about, 12 seasons now. And it's a very interesting community of people. There are a lot of characters, but what's interesting about the Simpsons community in Springfield is that the people can actually really easily be riled up to become an angry mob. This is the typical angry mob photo. So the idea is that when you are trying to draw from the wisdom of crowds, if you're merely using something where everyone can sign up for, so, oh, I'm going to mount this study on Twitter, I'm going to get people to sign up on Twitter or Facebook, it becomes problematic because you're not curating your responses. You're not curating who's actually responding to your studies. So there are 2 things that can happen, is that the tyranny of the herd actually starts to take overwhelming response, is that when people start seeing that something is popular, the tendency sometimes is to actually follow the populist opinion. So people actually start siding with the popular opinion, or they actually create an opposing bloc just for the sake of not following the opinion. So you get tyranny of the herd rather than the wisdom of the crowds. And this is why the early cases of prediction market were actually really good examples of how crowdsourcing was actually effective. But what happens over time is that people start learning the rules of this. And then prediction markets stop being novel and they don't work anymore because people start to game the system. They understand the rules and then they can game the system. So the question here really is, how do we control the sample? How do we curate the network? So we draw from a network of consultants, but how do we make sure that this network is reliable? How do we make sure that if we actually start collaborating on a project, for example, that they're not going to mess up? So from our point of view, there are 3 conditions for the wisdom of crowds to work, and these are the 3. The first one is that agents must have tested knowledge of the situation that they're making a judgment on. To just give a really simple example of how the wisdom of the crowds actually started is, let me invoke the imagery of a town fair. So in the past, they used to have town fairs, and they used to actually have these guess the weight of the cow kind of contests. What happens is that all the farmers in the town would actually come to this town fair, and they would make a guess on the weight of the cow. And this is based on their experience working with animals, farm animals, and based on what they know of farm animals. Whereas if you just got regular people to guess the weight of the cow, they'd probably be really, really off target. So what happens in these contests is that if you get people who have tacit knowledge on the subject, you actually realize that an average of all their guesses is probably really close to the right answer. And okay, I work and live in Singapore, so it's something that we see sometimes during Christmas. Are all of you familiar with the Ferrero Rocher chocolate? Yes? All right, Ferrero Rocher chocolate is really beautiful, right? So it's got gold wrapping, it's chocolate mixed with almonds. Inside you've got like pralines and stuff like that. So what happens during Christmas is that, Singapore is a city of malls. So some of the malls, what they do is they make this gigantic chocolate Christmas tree base made with nothing but Ferrero Rocher chocolates. And then they run this crowdsourcing contest. Hey, guess how many Ferrero Rocher chocolates it took to actually build this tree? So everybody starts guessing because, if you win, you get shopping vouchers and all that kind of stuff. But what you realize is that the people who win these contests are never the regular Joe. They're people who are engineers who understand how to build something, or people who have worked in the confectionery industry because they know how to work with chocolate or they've actually worked with Ferrero Rocher. They have tacit knowledge. So to give this a more real-world example is that in the past, when ships used to sink, right, and the Navy couldn't figure out where the ship sunk, what they tried to do is they actually gathered a pool of people to make a guess on where the ship sunk. But you don't just ask regular fishermen. You ask boat owners, ship captains, and people, submarine people. So you actually make them guess where the ship might have sunk based on their tacit knowledge, based on what knowledge you can give them of the situation. Usually an average of that guess is usually within the closest radius where the ship had sunk. So the first condition is that they must have tacit knowledge. So if you're asking people on how to do policy planning, for example, and they do not understand policy planning or they have a really uninformed perspective of what that is, you're going to get all sorts of outrageous kind of comments on the whole spectrum. So what's important is to actually curate the agents who respond to your study. The second is that agents must not be aware of what the other agents have guessed. Okay, again, this goes back to the problem with the tyranny of the herd. If you know what everyone else is guessing, you can either go with the popular opinion or you can create an opposing bloc simply because you want to. And if you ask a question that is too explicit in the sense that people know what the desired answer is. A very famous example of this is, I'm sure everyone's aware of this, if you've ever done an employee satisfaction survey. Yes? I think everyone has done that. So what these employee satisfaction surveys usually do is a simple question. What is, based on a Likert scale of 1 to 5, for example, how would you rate your boss's orders? Are they clear? So 1 to 5, you rate it, right? So on a scale of 0 to 10, how often do your managers consult you? So what happens is I used to work for a big organization and I was doing this employee satisfaction survey. So I went to the guy who was conducting the survey and I said, I have about 6 different managers. Which one are you talking about? So he said, add them together over the past year and then average it out and then put it on the scale. It makes no sense, right? And you already know what the ideal answer is. It's 9 to 10. So to be on the safe side, you might give a 7 or 8. If you're really feeling really disinterested, that day you give a 5. Or you've just had a big fight with your boss, you might give him a 2. So it's easy to game because the questions are explicit, you know what the ideal answer is. And so it becomes ineffective in getting opinions. The last condition is that they must have no major stake in the outcome. What happens when the stakes are too huge is that you give emotional responses rather than things that are actually carefully cognitively decided. Or there's an attempt to sway or try to manipulate the general response. This is why most approaches to prediction markets don't work, because people are too emotionally invested. When you ask traders to guess, they're too emotionally invested in it. So a lot of crowdsourcing solutions actually fail one or most of these tests. So our approach is actually to create ordinary networks that can be activated for extraordinary need. If you look at this cartoon here, this is from one of our favorite cartoonists. This is Gaping Void. It's quite interesting, you can go check it out. But he says that the good news is that everyone's hyper-connected. The bad news is that that's all they are. Okay? So it's important to actually curate that network of people that you're drawing responses from. So to give you an example of this, we're actually starting a project with Ohio University in the United States. And this is a healthcare project. What we do is, for example, we wanted to understand how patients' lived experience of diabetes is. So we actually curated a network of diabetes patients. So patients who are actually going through this on a day-to-day basis, we give them digital diaries. So they start giving responses, they tell us how their day went, and we have a unique system, a patented system of indexing, which they then go through to index their experiences based on their own interpretation. So what happens is this, we actually get a constant feedback of data, and this is valuable data. But what's more important is that we have this ordinary network now that is giving us valuable data on a daily basis, but it also can be activated for extraordinary needs. So if there is a new drug that you're testing, for example, you can push a question out into that database or into that network, and they can actually respond to your question on an as-needed basis. So you actually start creating an ordinary network, but you can use it for extraordinary need. Another example of a project that we're doing with a similar kind of network system is that we're working with the Colombian government on how to understand entrepreneurs. So we actually assemble a network of entrepreneurs. This is everybody working from IT incubators to people who are in little slums who own like a little mobile phone shops, for example. So what we do in these kind of circumstances is we actually create, again, a network of entrepreneurs, and it's a very good way to gain a descriptive and evaluative framework for what's going on. It's a good way to provide learning lessons between these different groups of entrepreneurs. So we're creating a curated network. Again, it's not just any other person who wants to be an entrepreneur, that people who are actually out there having challenges, succeeding from those challenges, failures, and we actually create a descriptive system from that network. So this is one way that we're actually going about it. I've talked a bit about the kind of indexing system we've used so far. So let's take a look at what this looks like. So what a typical Sensemaker project does is that, again, we deal with micro-narrative. So we actually post a question, and we ask people to share responses. So it could be share a story about something, because we work with micro-narrative. So if you ask too explicit a question, again, you're not going to get a very good answer. So another project that we're actually doing is with the Mexican government, and we're trying to understand the drug culture, how people are responding to drug variants. And the idea is that you don't want children to be sucked into the drug culture because they're often used as meals or they're used to sell drugs in the streets. So the idea is that you can't go and ask people, so what do you think of the drug variants? No one's ever going to say anything bad because the fear of retribution is too great. So what happens is we actually ask children, because children can be used very easily as ethnographers. When a child approaches you for something, you go into teaching mode and you don't mind sharing your experiences with them. So we ask children to actually stand in the front of churches every Sunday and ask people, if the Lady of Guadalupe were to return to Mexico City today, right, what story would you tell her that would actually make her really happy or make her really sad? It's not an explicit question. You're going to get more authentic kind of experiences from that. And then from there, the experiences are asked to be tagged on a series of indexes like this. So if you look at the top, you see two triangles. These are what we call triads. These are our patented indexing system. So instead of having a Likert scale where you're measuring one thing on a 0 to 10 scale, you know what the ideal answer is. When we design a triad, we take a concept and we use 3 influencing factors that actually influence that concept. So when people are indexing, they're actually forced to make trade-offs between those concepts. So in this case, for example, the story has to do with policy, implementation, or financing. These are actually examples of a framework that we actually deployed for a project with a water company called S. It was a project funded by the Gates Foundation. So this S actually goes out into Africa and digs boreholes. So it's a water implementation kind of company. So they wanted to understand if they were actually channeling financing into the right area. So if you ask people, hey, what does this situation really need? And you give them like maybe 5 boxes, tick up to 3, they tick all 3. but you don't understand to varying degrees what they really need. So in this case, they're forced to make trade-offs. It might have needed more policy, more implementation, but less financing. So they'll put it that way. So it's not just all three. We understand the problems that influence the situation. But what you really want to know is the patterns and the extent to which it influences the situation. So this is just an example to give you a real example from a project we're actually running. This is, interestingly, this is with Singapore government. Just a very vague example. This is how we design a triad. So we take a concept. So in this case, the concept is of meritocracy. We abstract the concept, and then we have 3 triad points. So to the top, you see everyone should be treated the same. It's a concept of meritocracy that talks about equality or equitability. So it's a lot to do with the Mata sense capability approach. So it's equality of opportunity in a sense. To the bottom left, you see everyone should be treated according to their merit. So this is more of a you work for what you get kind of mentality. The bottom right, stand on your own feet. This one is actually more towards individualism, elitism. And meritocracy is one of the actually very strong bastion of Singapore's society. Again, between the points, they also mean things. So if they're more towards the left, it's more of a capability-driven approach. So meritocracy has taken on a more capability-driven approach. More towards the bottom is actually that there's a lot of skepticism with the concept of democracy. So basically, every point here actually could represent something. And just to give you an example, these are the kind of patterns of indexing that come out. So when you give people a chance to index on a triad, right, underlying the triad, they're actually statistical weighting. But the people who are indexing aren't aware of the statistical weight. But what happens is after they have done the indexing, this one is about, I think we have about 5,000 indexes within this triad. So you start seeing very valuable patterns forming. You start seeing where the skew is towards, where it's not towards, is it whirling or not. So this is actually a longitudinal project that we're running with the government. It's going to be running over 2 years, and the questions are pushed out every 3 months. So you start tracking at 3-month intervals, you see where the patterns start forming. And they become a very quick visual way of seeing how things are shifting. All right. The other example that I've got here is a project that we actually did with the British government on pre-radicalization. What we did was we actually had to go out and understand how radicalization happens. So we actually went out and interviewed people in refugee communities in Pakistan, and we also interviewed people of Pakistani descent in Britain. And the way it worked is that we pushed out student ethnographers, and we got them to interview 3 generations of people in their family or in their community. So it has to be 3 generations, and to share stories on their experiences of being Pakistani, their experiences of being Muslim, things like that. And what we can do with the software as well is we can plot it on a 3-dimensional scale. So this is what we call a landscape. So in this picture, you actually see some valleys, some concave valleys. Those are actually attitudes and opinions that are very clearly formed. That's why they're sunk in. Okay? The ones at the very bottom are very clearly formed attitudes. The ones at the top, the sporadic spurts out there, those are actually outliers. And that's the other thing that's important to capture. When you do a survey, you're looking at the big numbers. What happens is that you're looking at a Gaussian kind of distribution. So you actually miss the weak signals. And the weak signals are usually the destabilizing factors and actually causes the situation to tip over. So the things that are sporadic spurts are important to look at. And that's where you actually start to see very diversified opinions. To give you some examples, these are narratives. We deal with narrative. So each of these blue dots actually represent a data point. So you can actually rubber band the data point, zero in, pull out the narrative behind the indexing. And then you can make more sense of the context under which that this was signified. So if you have a moment, you can read the stories. They are pretty interesting. This is actual data. So you can see that the sporadic points come from stories that are actually quite extreme. The other kind of media that we can actually accommodate with Sensemaker is that some people upload photos, some people upload audio. So I heard this sound in my community today and it was not normal, so they can actually record that. They also allow people to put in coordinates, so we actually worked with West Point College, and we got officer cadets to actually put digital entries on eye touches in the field, so they plug in their coordinates and tell the story about what happened at that point. And then they go through the system of indexing, and you can start seeing the patterns form, especially when you have large scales of data. So what we do is we have instantaneous feedback. So once the stories and the data has been saved into the server, you can actually pull it out of the system immediately. So the feedback is actually continuous, and you have an immediate feedback loop. This actually takes place within a larger system, of course, of analysis. We have some theoretical background. We can help to gain perspective. So insofar, I've only spoken about this part, mass sensing and monitoring. So it has to, of course, take place within larger scale intervention, informed intervention, and mapping into different kinds of situational frameworks. And actually, that's all I have for you today.